There is a kind of person who builds everything right and still ends up with nothing that feels alive. I was that person for a long time, and I had absolutely no idea what was wrong. I remember sitting in my apartment on a Tuesday evening, surrounded by everything that was supposed to mean success: a job that paid well, a relationship that looked healthy from the outside, a gym routine, a morning schedule, a 5-year plan written out in a notebook that I kept updating and never actually following. Everything was in order. Everything was correct. And yet something inside me felt like a compass spinning in circles, pointing everywhere at once and landing nowhere. That feeling is hard to describe to someone who has never had it. It is not sadness exactly. It is more like standing in a room that is fully furnished but does not feel like yours. Like you moved into someone else's life and just started maintaining it. I spent about 3 years in that state. 3 years of doing all the right things and feeling quietly hollow at the center of all of them. I tried different approaches. I read books about discipline and productivity. I went through a phase of journaling every single morning. I even tried therapy for a while, which helped with some things, but still left this particular thing untouched. The hollow feeling stayed. It was patient. It was not going anywhere. The crack appeared on an ordinary Wednesday. I was walking back from a coffee shop near my apartment, holding a paper cup that was already going cold, and I stopped in front of a small garden someone had planted between 2 buildings, just a patch of green in the middle of the city. There was something growing there that looked completely unremarkable, a thin stem with 2 small leaves, pushed up through dark, wet soil. And I stood there for probably 2 full minutes, just staring at it, which is the kind of thing you do when something in you is starving for an answer and you do not yet know what the question is. I was not thinking about philosophy. I was not thinking about anything profound. I was just tired and a little lost and somehow unable to walk away from this tiny piece of green life pushing itself up through the ground without asking anyone's permission. That was the moment something cracked open. Not dramatically. No lightning, no voice from the sky, just a quiet shift, the kind you only recognize later when you trace back through your memory looking for where things began to change. The thought that arrived was simple. Something is growing here because 2 completely different things found each other. Not one thing doing all the work, 2 things meeting, and something third happening because of that. I did not understand what that meant yet, but I felt it. And that feeling followed me home and sat with me while the coffee went fully cold and the evening got dark. I kept coming back to it. Something about creation requiring more than one force. Something about the idea that everything I had been building alone, using only one part of myself, was structurally incomplete from the start. That was the beginning of the most important investigation of my life. Not a spiritual crisis exactly, more like a long overdue audit of something I had been running wrong for years. I had been using one half of my inner engine and wondering why the car kept stalling. I just did not know yet which half I had been ignoring, or that there even was another half to find. If any part of what I just described sounds familiar, I want you to stay with me, because what I figured out over the following months completely changed the way I understand myself, the way I build things, and the way I connect with other people. Friends, if this is already hitting close to home, subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps this reach the people who need it most. So here's the thing that nobody tells you about the ancient Hermetic laws. 6 of them get discussed constantly. You have probably heard of them. The law of attraction gets turned into motivational posters. The law of cause and effect shows up in every self-help book. The law of vibration has its own entire industry built around it. But the 7th law, the one called the law of gender, gets almost no attention. And in my experience, it is the most structurally important one of all. When I first came across it, I almost skipped past it. The name made me assume it was about men and women, about biology, about social roles. It sounded like something that belonged in a gender studies classroom or a very specific kind of spiritual retreat. I was wrong in the most interesting way possible. This law has nothing to do with men and women in the way we usually talk about them. It is about 2 fundamental forces that exist inside every single human being, inside every atom, inside every act of creation that has ever happened anywhere in the universe. The law says simply this: everything contains both a generative principle and a receptive principle. Everything, without exception. And when those two principles are out of balance, creation stops. Things begin, but do not finish. Energy moves, but produces nothing. People work constantly and feel like they are going nowhere. That description hit me like cold water, because that was exactly what my life had felt like for 3 years. Constant motion, no arrival. I had been operating with one principle almost completely dominant and the other almost completely silent. And the worst part is that the culture I grew up in had trained me to see that imbalance as a strength. To be all forward motion, all logic, all output, all direction. To treat stillness as laziness. To treat intuition as unreliable. To treat receptivity as weakness. I had built an entire identity around half of my own nature and spent years wondering why that identity felt like a costume that did not quite fit. The law of gender is not a New Age concept. It is encoded in alchemical texts that are centuries old. It appears in Taoist philosophy as yin and yang. It surfaces in Jungian psychology under different names. It shows up in the structure of every myth cycle that has survived long enough to reach us. The reason it keeps reappearing across completely different traditions and completely different centuries is that it is describing something real, something structural, not a belief system, a pattern in the architecture of existence itself. And once I understood what it was actually saying, I could not look at my stalled projects, my fractured relationships, or that hollow feeling in my apartment the same way again. Every one of those things had the fingerprints of this imbalance all over them. I just had not known what I was looking at. Now I was beginning to. Most people who feel stuck do not have a motivation problem. They have a fire problem. And I do not mean that as a metaphor about passion or inspiration. I mean something far more specific and far more strange than that. After I understood what the law of gender was actually pointing at, the first thing I had to look at honestly was the initiating force inside me, the part that starts things, the part that cuts through fog and moves. In the old texts, this is called the masculine principle, and I want to be very clear about what that means because the word masculine immediately triggers 100 wrong associations. This has nothing to do with being a man, nothing to do with being tough or dominant or emotionally closed. The masculine principle is simply the force that initiates. That is its entire job. It is the moment before movement becomes movement. It is the decision that happens before the action. Every person alive has this force inside them, regardless of who they are or how they were raised. But here's what I found when I looked honestly at mine. It was not weak exactly. It was misdirected. It was like a fire that had been burning in the wrong room of the house for years. Lots of heat, no warmth where it was actually needed. I thought about a friend of mine named Daniel. I had known Daniel for about 6 years at that point, and he was one of the most energetic people I had ever met. Constantly moving, constantly planning, always had 3 projects running at once. From the outside, he looked like someone who had the initiating force completely figured out. He was always on fire about something. But every single project he started either stalled at the halfway point or collapsed the moment it required something other than pure forward momentum. He could not finish anything. He could not sit with uncertainty. He could not let something breathe and develop at its own pace. His fire was real, but it was burning everything it touched because it had no place to land. I recognized myself in him more than I wanted to admit. My own initiating force had always been strong in short bursts. I could start things with enormous energy. The first 2 weeks of any project I was unstoppable. Then something would shift, and the fire would die down, and I would tell myself I had lost interest, when really what had happened was that I had been running entirely on initiation and had no idea how to move into the slower, deeper phase that follows it. The masculine principle at its healthiest is not just fire. It is directed fire. It is the kind of energy that knows where it is going and why. It cuts clearly. It holds a line. It protects what matters.
And it does all of this without needing to dominate everything around it in order to feel real. That distinction matters enormously. A flame in a lantern lights the path. The same flame loose in a dry field destroys everything in its reach. The energy is identical. The container is completely different. I started paying attention to the moments in my day when I felt that initiating force move through me cleanly. It was always when I had a clear question I was trying to answer. Not a goal exactly, more like a direction with a purpose behind it. When that was present, the energy felt sharp and clean. When it was absent, the energy scattered. Same person, completely different output depending on whether the fire had something real to burn toward. That realization changed how I worked, how I planned, and eventually how I understood the next layer of all of this. Because the masculine principle does not operate in isolation. It has an internal architecture that the old traditions mapped out in extraordinary detail. And once I found that map, some of the most confusing patterns of my life suddenly had names. Here is where it gets genuinely strange and genuinely useful at the same time. The people who studied these inner forces for centuries did not describe them as one thing. They described them as four distinct expressions, four faces of the same fire, each one doing something the others cannot. And the reason this matters is not academic. The reason it matters is that most people have one or two of these faces fully developed, and the others almost completely dark. And the ones that are dark are almost always the exact ones that life is currently demanding from you. The first face is the one I am going to call the striker. This is the part of you that acts under pressure without freezing. It is not recklessness. It is the capacity to move through fear rather than around it. When this is developed in a person, you can feel it in the room. There is a groundedness to them, a readiness that does not need to announce itself. When it is absent, the person has all the intention in the world and cannot cross the starting line. I had this one reasonably developed, which is probably why I could always begin things. The problem was, it was the only face I had been cultivating. The second face is what I think of as the architect. This is the part of you that leads without needing to control. It creates order not by forcing things into shape, but by holding a structure that allows others to find their place within it. The architect is steady. The architect does not panic when the plan changes. The architect understands that real authority comes from clarity, not volume. I was significantly underdeveloped here. I could start things, but I could not hold them. The moment a project or a relationship required me to provide stable structure over a long period of time, something in me would get restless and start looking for the next beginning. The third face is the decoder, the part that transforms information into understanding. Not just collecting facts, but actually seeing the pattern underneath them, asking the question nobody else thought to ask. This face loves complexity and is not threatened by it. This was the part of me that had led me to the law of gender in the first place. It was alive. But it was disconnected from the other faces, which meant I could understand things deeply and still not be able to apply them. The fourth face is the one that surprised me most when I finally looked at it honestly. I will call it the anchor. It is the part that connects, that directs energy toward another person with full attention and genuine care. Not performance, not strategy, actual presence. This face is what makes the fire warm rather than just hot. And mine was almost completely dark. Not because I did not care about people, but because I had learned somewhere along the way that directing my full attention and energy towards something or someone felt dangerously close to losing control of it. So I kept just enough distance to feel safe. And that distance had a cost that I was only beginning to calculate. The most dangerous version of imbalance is the one that looks exactly like success from the outside. And that is not a warning. That is something I lived inside for long enough to know every corner of it. After I mapped out those four faces of the initiating force, the natural next question was, which direction does the imbalance actually tip? And the answer surprised me because it was not one direction. It was two completely opposite directions, and both of them felt like suffering, just wearing different clothes. Let me tell you about the first direction first, because it is the one nobody questions. I had a colleague at the time named Marcus. Sharp, fast, always the loudest and most certain voice in any room. Marcus could walk into a conversation where 5 people disagreed, and within 10 minutes, everyone had been redirected toward his position. He was genuinely impressive to watch. He made decisions instantly and defended them with total conviction. People around him described him as strong. They used words like driven, and decisive and clear. And for a long time, I looked at Marcus and felt something close to admiration mixed with a small, uncomfortable feeling I could not name. It took me almost 2 years of knowing him to understand what that feeling was. It was recognition, not of his strengths, but of the shadow underneath them. Because Marcus never asked questions he did not already have the answer to. He never sat in a meeting and genuinely listened to a perspective that contradicted his own. His certainty was not wisdom, it was armor. And the cost of that armor was that nothing around him could grow in a direction he had not already approved of. Projects stalled not because of lack of energy, but because of too much control applied in too tight a pattern. Relationships with him eventually all hit the same wall. People stopped bringing him real information because the response was always the same shape. He would override it. And over time, the people around him stopped being collaborators and started being audience members. That is what the initiating force looks like when it runs without any check on itself. It stops initiating and starts dominating. The fire does not illuminate anymore. It just burns. And the person inside it genuinely believes they are being strong. That is the terrifying part. From inside that imbalance, it does not feel like a problem. It feels like the only way to keep things from falling apart. Every moment of control feels justified. Every override feels necessary. The feedback that something is wrong only arrives through the wreckage that accumulates over time. The second direction is quieter and, in some ways, more painful to witness. I saw it clearly in myself during a specific period, the 18 months before I found any of this material, when the hollow feeling I described earlier was at its worst. The initiating force does not always burn too hot. Sometimes it goes almost completely cold. And when it does, the person still wakes up every morning, still goes through the motions, still has thoughts about what they want to build or change or become. But the gap between the thought and the first movement toward it becomes enormous. Days pass, then weeks. The notebook with the 5-year plan gets updated, but nothing in real life changes to match it. I remember one specific Saturday morning during that period. I had planned to start working on something I genuinely cared about, a project I had been thinking about for months. I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, looked at the blank document for probably 40 minutes, then closed it and spent the rest of the day doing nothing in particular. Not resting, not recharging, just drifting through the hours in a way that left a residue of self-disappointment that I carried into the next week. That pattern repeated itself more times than I want to count. The intention was there. The readiness never arrived. And the more times the cycle repeated, the heavier the starting felt. Until eventually, I stopped even sitting down at the desk. That is the cold version of the imbalance. Not domination, paralysis. And it is just as much a distortion of the same force. The fire is not gone. It is buried under a layer of accumulated proof that it will not catch. The person becomes a spectator of their own potential, which is its own very specific kind of loss. Both extremes, the Marcus version and the Saturday morning version, are the same engine running wrong. One is redlined and burning everything. The other is stalled and going nowhere. And here is what I eventually understood. Neither of those problems can be solved by more of the same energy. More discipline does not fix the cold version. More willpower does not fix the hot version. Something else is needed entirely. Something that the masculine principle cannot supply to itself. And that something had a name that I had been walking past for years without stopping to look at it properly. Because just as the initiating force has its architecture, its faces, and its shadows, there is an entirely different force running alongside it that most people have been systematically taught to distrust. Not the fire. The other thing. The force that does not push at all. The force that generates from stillness. The force that knows things before it can explain how it knows them. I had spent years calling that force unreliable, soft, impractical. I had built an entire approach to life around sidelining it, and it had been costing me everything I actually wanted the whole time. I'm talking about the other half of what the law of gender actually describes. And once I started paying attention to it honestly, the thing I found there was so different from anything I expected that it took me several weeks just to sit with it. without immediately trying to analyze it into something manageable. Because this force does not respond well to analysis. It responds to something else entirely. Something that took me a long time to learn how to do. The feminine principle, and I want you to hold that term loosely and not let it trigger anything cultural or biological, is the force inside you that receives rather than reaches, that generates from depth rather than from speed, that knows through feeling rather than through logic. Every single person has this force inside them. It is not soft in the way weakness is soft. It is soft in the way deep water is soft. You can put your hand through it, but it is also capable of carrying enormous weight and moving in ways that no hard surface ever could. I had ignored mine almost completely, and the moment I started to look at it directly, I realized it had not gone anywhere. It had just been waiting in a room I had kept locked for a very long time. The smell of that room, when I finally opened the door, was strange and familiar at the same time. Like finding a part of yourself you forgot you had left behind somewhere. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just quietly there, waiting. Patient in a way that the fire never is. Nobody warned me that learning to rest would be harder than learning to work. And I mean that in the most literal and unsettling way possible. When I first started paying honest attention to the feminine principle inside me, the locked room I mentioned at the end of the last part, the first thing I noticed was how uncomfortable stillness felt. Not peaceful, not restorative, uncomfortable. Like sitting in a chair that is slightly the wrong size. I had been in motion for so long, filling every gap with tasks and plans and forward momentum, that the moment I stopped pushing, something in me immediately started generating reasons to start pushing again. My mind would produce an urgent task from nowhere. My body would get restless. I would check my phone, reorganize something that did not need reorganizing, find a reason to be productive rather than present. I recognized eventually that this was not a discipline problem. It was a fear response. I had trained myself over many years to treat stillness as a signal that something was wrong, that if I was not moving, I was falling behind, that receptivity was just a polite word for passivity, and passivity was dangerous. That understanding came slowly and cost me more than a few weekends of sitting with extreme discomfort before something on the other side of it began to appear. The thing that finally cracked this open for me was not a book or a conversation. It was a walk I took one evening along a river path near the edge of the city. I had been going there occasionally for years, but always with headphones in, always listening to something, always consuming information while my feet moved. That particular evening, my headphones had died, and I had left the charger at home, which felt annoying at first, and then became something else entirely. The river was low that season, and the exposed stones along the bank were a pale gray color, and the water moved around them in small, branching channels that kept shifting and reforming without any of the stones changing position at all. The water found its way. It did not force. It did not push against the stones until they moved. It simply moved around them and kept going, and the path it carved was different every time, and somehow always arrived at the same place. I stood there for a long time watching that. The air smelled like wet earth and something green and alive. A bird was making a sound somewhere in the reeds, a low, repetitive sound that was almost more felt than heard. And something in me went quiet in a way it almost never did. Not empty, quiet. The difference between those two things is enormous, and I had not known the difference before that evening. That river was the first real image I had for what the feminine principle actually feels like when it is functioning. Not passive, not weak, not waiting to be told what to do. Alive in a completely different way than fire is alive. Responsive rather than assertive. Intelligent in a way that does not announce itself. And, crucially, generative. That water was constantly creating new paths, new channels, new forms.
It was not imitating creation, it was creating, quietly, without effort, without force, simply by being fully what it was. The reason I am telling you this story before getting into the deeper architecture of this force is that the architecture only makes sense once you feel the thing first. If you approach the feminine principle purely analytically, you miss it. It is like trying to understand music by only reading sheet notation and never actually hearing the sound. The map is not the territory. And with this particular territory, the feeling has to come before the understanding. Now, here is what the understanding revealed, and this is where the old traditions had mapped things out in a way I found genuinely startling. Just as the masculine principle has 4 faces that it expresses through, the feminine principle also has 4 distinct expressions, 4 ways it manifests inside a person, and each one carries a completely different quality of intelligence and power. The first one I will call the wellspring. This is the part of you that generates care without depleting itself. Real sustaining care, not the performative kind that burns the caregiver to ash over time. The wellspring gives because it is genuinely full, not because it is afraid of what happens if it withholds. I had a woman in my life named Elena who embodied this quality more completely than anyone else I have ever known. She was not endlessly accommodating. She was not a people pleaser. She had clear limits, and she communicated them without drama. But within those limits, she had a quality of generative warmth that made everyone around her feel more capable of becoming who they were trying to become. That quality is not softness in the weak sense. It is a form of inner abundance that produces real things in the world, not despite its gentleness, but because of it. The second expression I think of as the spark of beginning. It is the part that holds pure creative potential before it has been shaped by fear or expectation. Every person has moments of this. The feeling of a genuinely new idea arriving before the voice that says it will not work gets there. The fresh curiosity about something you have never explored before. The lightness of not yet knowing the outcome. In children, this expression is almost always visible and alive. In most adults, it has been so thoroughly trained out by the demand to be practical and certain that it has gone underground. When I started looking for mine honestly, I found it buried under about 15 years of prioritizing efficiency over exploration. The third expression is one I deeply respect and took the longest to understand. I will call it the deep reader. This is the part that accumulates lived experience and distills it into knowing that cannot be fully explained in logical steps. It reads people accurately without being able to say exactly how. It senses when something is off in a situation before any of the visible evidence confirms it. It understands patterns that operate below the surface of things. I had spent years dismissing this in myself as guesswork or confirmation bias. I had been wrong about that. The deep reader is not irrational. It is differently rational. It operates on a kind of parallel processing that the analytical mind cannot replicate, because the analytical mind can only work with what it can see and name, and reality contains far more than what can be seen and named. The fourth expression is the one that ties all the others together. I will call it the steady center. This is the part that can hold authority and compassion in the same hand without one canceling out the other. It makes decisions that are both clear and kind. It leads without needing to diminish anyone in order to feel elevated. It is the integration of strength and tenderness into something that does not wobble under pressure. This expression was the one I found most absent in myself, and not coincidentally, it was the one that every meaningful relationship in my life had been quietly asking for all along. The feminine principle out of balance does not look like weakness. It looks like drowning. And the cruelest part is that from the inside, it feels like caring too much, which sounds almost noble until you see what it actually costs. I need to talk about this directly because, after mapping out those 4 expressions of the feminine principle, the wellspring, the spark of beginning, the deep reader, and the steady center, the obvious next question is what happens when this force goes wrong. And the answer is that it goes wrong in 2 completely opposite directions, just like the masculine principle did, and both of them are far more common than most people realize. Let me start with the flood. I watched this happen to someone close to me over the course of about 2 years. And I say watched, but the truth is, I participated in it without understanding what I was seeing. Her name was Nina, and when I first met her, she was one of the most genuinely intuitive and emotionally present people I had encountered. She had a quality of attention that made you feel fully seen when she was focused on you. That quality was real. It was one of the expressions of the feminine principle working at its best. But somewhere in the years I knew her, that quality lost its container. What I mean by that is the following. The same receptivity that made her perceptive also made her absorb everything around her without filtering. Other people's moods became her moods. Other people's problems became her emergencies. She could not be in a room where someone was unhappy without feeling personally responsible for fixing it. And the more she gave in that direction, the more she felt she was not giving enough, because the feeling of being responsible for everyone's emotional state is a hole that cannot be filled no matter how much you pour into it. By the time I understood what was happening, she had become someone who described herself almost exclusively in relation to other people's needs. She did not have preferences of her own anymore, or rather, she had them, but she had stopped trusting them as valid. Her own needs felt like inconveniences. Her own pain felt like selfishness. She had dissolved so completely into the receptive mode that there was almost no defined self left to do the receiving. Just this open, exhausted, endlessly accommodating presence that could not say no to anything without a wave of internal shame following immediately after. That is the flood. Emotions without banks. Receptivity without a center to receive from. The feminine principle at full volume with nothing to give it shape or direction. And what makes it particularly hard to address is that from the outside, it can look like extraordinary kindness and generosity, which means the people around that person often reinforce exactly the pattern that is causing the damage. The desert is the other direction, and it is, in some ways, quieter, but equally costly. I lived in a version of this myself during the period I described earlier, the 18 months of hollow productivity and stalled projects. When the feminine principle is cut off, not just underdeveloped but actively suppressed, the inner landscape becomes dry in a very specific way. Ideas stop arriving spontaneously. The feeling of genuine interest in things fades until everything feels equally neutral, not terrible, just flat. Connections with other people stay on the surface because going deeper would require accessing a feeling capacity that has been shut down. The person functions, they execute, they complete tasks, but there is no moisture to anything. Nothing grows, nothing surprises them. And the worst part is that they often cannot tell what is missing because the very faculty that would recognize the absence is the one that has gone silent. I remember a conversation with a friend during that period where he asked me what I was genuinely excited about, and I sat there for a long pause and could not produce an answer. Not because nothing good was happening in my life, but because the part of me that would normally generate that feeling of aliveness in response to things I cared about had gone somewhere I could not reach. That conversation disturbed me more than almost anything else during that time, because it was the first moment I understood that something was not just difficult, but actually missing. Both the flood and the desert, and this took me a long time to understand, come from the same original wound. The flood is what happens when a person learns that their value comes entirely from how much they can give and absorb for others. The desert is what happens when a person learns that their inner world is not safe or trustworthy, and the only reliable thing is external performance. Different survival strategies, same root fear. Which means fixing either one requires going to the same place, back to the center, back to the question of what it actually feels like to be fully present in yourself, without either dissolving into others or cutting yourself off from your own depth. That realization shifted something important in how I understood the whole picture. Because up to that point, I had been thinking about the masculine and feminine principles as separate problems to be solved separately. Fix the fire, then fix the water. But the more I looked at it, the more I realized they are not separate systems at all. They are two expressions of one thing. And the dysfunction in one is almost always mirrored by a corresponding dysfunction in the other. Which brought me to a question I had not been expecting to face. If these two forces are this deeply interconnected, and if both of them exist inside every single person, and if the imbalance in one creates and amplifies the imbalance in the other, then the problem is not really about fixing either force individually. The problem is structural. It is about how the whole thing is organized. And to understand that, I had to stop looking at myself entirely and start looking at the universe. I know that sounds like a large pivot. It is. But what I found when I made that pivot was not abstract philosophy. It was the most grounding and clarifying thing I had encountered in the entire investigation. Because the law of gender, the seventh Hermetic principle I had stumbled into months earlier through a crack in an ordinary Wednesday, turns out to describe something that is not just psychological. It describes something that is woven into the fabric of how reality actually operates at every level of scale simultaneously. What I mean by that requires stepping back very far from the personal story for a moment. Far enough to see something that changes how the personal story looks entirely. The masculine and feminine principles are not human inventions. They are not cultural constructs. They are not metaphors borrowed from nature to describe psychology. They are the actual operating pattern of existence itself. And once you see that clearly, once you really feel the weight of it, the imbalance inside you stops feeling like a personal failure and starts feeling like something completely different. Something with a different kind of solution. Everything I had been trying to fix about myself was the wrong problem. And the moment I understood that, something in my chest went very quiet in a way that felt less like relief and more like the ground finally stopping its shaking. I had spent months at this point studying the masculine principle, mapping its four faces, watching its shadows in Marcus and in myself. I had spent weeks beginning to understand the feminine principle, sitting with the river, recognizing Nina's flood and my own desert. I had built up this detailed internal map of two forces and their expressions and their dysfunctions. And somewhere in the middle of all that careful mapping, I had been operating under a hidden assumption that I had not examined yet. The assumption was that the goal was to fix each force separately. Get the fire right. Get the water right. Then somehow, the two corrected things would coexist peacefully and life would improve. That assumption was completely wrong. And the thing that broke it open for me was not a conversation or a book. It was an afternoon I spent in a science museum that I had walked past hundreds of times without ever going inside. I had gone in mostly to get out of the rain. It was one of those gray afternoons where the sky feels like a ceiling pressing down, and the air smells like damp stone and bus exhaust. I ended up standing in front of an exhibit about stellar formation, how stars are born. There was a large illuminated panel showing the process in stages. A vast cloud of gas and dust, diffuse and spread across an enormous area with no particular shape. Then gravity, a contracting force pulling everything inward, compressing the cloud toward a center. Then, at a certain threshold of compression, ignition. The star lights up. Light and heat begin pouring outward in every direction. I stood in front of that panel for a long time. The guard near the door probably thought I was strange. But what I was seeing was not astronomy. What I was seeing was the masculine and feminine principles operating at the scale of star creation. The diffuse cloud, the receptive field, the vast potential waiting to be gathered. The contracting force, the initiating principle, the directional pull toward a center. And then the third thing. The star itself, which is neither the cloud nor the force alone, but something that could not exist without both of them meeting at exactly the right point. The star is not the sum of its ingredients. The star is what happens when the two principles complete each other. Remove the cloud, and the contracting force has nothing to work with. Remove the contracting force, and the cloud just drifts forever, full of potential that never becomes anything. The creation only happens when both are present and both are functioning, and neither is trying to do the other's job. That image reorganized everything I had been building in my understanding. Because suddenly the question was not, how do I fix the fire and how do I fix the water separately? The question was, how do I get these two forces inside me to actually meet? Not to coexist in the same person, like two separate departments in a building that never communicate, but to genuinely encounter each other, to work together, to produce the third thing that neither can produce alone.
And here is the paradox that sits at the center of all of this, the thing I had been circling without landing on it directly. The masculine principle, no matter how fully developed, cannot complete itself. It can initiate endlessly. It can direct and cut and move and build, but it cannot generate the thing that makes all that movement meaningful. It cannot receive its own output. It cannot transform what it produces into something living. It reaches, and the reaching itself becomes the only thing. Without the feminine principle to receive and transform what the masculine initiates, the masculine just keeps firing into empty space. And the feminine principle, no matter how deep and rich and generative it is, cannot activate itself. It can hold enormous potential. It can feel everything and understand everything and create the most fertile inner landscape imaginable. But without something to initiate the process, that potential stays exactly that. Potential. The most alive, intelligent, feeling, deeply knowing potential that never becomes anything in the world because nothing came to meet it and set it into motion. I had been watching this play out in my own life for years without understanding what I was looking at. The projects that stalled halfway were almost always projects where I had initiated with enormous force and then had no capacity to let them breathe and develop in their own direction. I kept pushing when the situation was asking me to pause and receive new information. The relationships that went flat were relationships where I had been so focused on moving forward and building something that I had never learned to simply be present in them without an agenda. And the hollow feeling in my apartment on those Tuesday evenings was the feeling of a fire that had been burning without anything to illuminate. Heat with no warmth. Motion with no meaning. The masculine without the feminine is like a compass needle spinning in a room where someone has removed all the magnetic north. It moves constantly and points nowhere. And the feminine without the masculine is like a deep lake in a sealed cave. Perfect stillness, perfect depth, perfect darkness. All that water going nowhere, touching nothing, producing nothing. What finally stopped my own spinning was not a decision exactly. It was more like a recognition. The recognition that I had been at war with half of my own nature for a very long time. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but systematically, thoroughly, and with the full endorsement of everything in my environment that had rewarded the fire and treated the water as something to be managed rather than listened to. And the moment that recognition arrived, the obvious next question was, what does it actually look like when they stop being at war? What does it feel like when the fire and the water meet inside a person and produce that third thing? The alchemists had a specific name for this moment. They called it the sacred marriage. And when I first encountered that phrase, I had immediately assumed it was a metaphor for something else, something external, something about relationships between people. I was wrong about that too. In the most important way possible. The sacred marriage is not a metaphor. It is a precise description of an inner event that changes everything about how a person moves through the world. And I know exactly when it began happening in me, because the feeling of it was unlike anything I had experienced before or since. It arrived not in a dramatic moment, but in the middle of something completely ordinary. Which is, I think, always how the real things arrive. I had been waiting my whole life for a dramatic moment of transformation, and the actual transformation arrived while I was washing dishes on a Thursday evening, with no music playing and nothing remarkable happening anywhere in my life. That is where part 12 left off. The sacred marriage arriving in the middle of something completely ordinary. And I want to stay with that for a moment before I tell you what happened next, because the ordinariness of it is actually the most important part. I had a plate in my hand. Warm water was running over it. The window above the sink was dark, and I could see a faint reflection of the kitchen light in it. And I noticed something that I had never noticed before in quite the same way. I was doing the task and also listening to the sound of the water at the same time. I was focused and also open simultaneously. The striker in me was doing the job cleanly and efficiently, but the deep reader was also present, not analyzing, just receiving the sensory information of the moment without needing to do anything with it.
For a few seconds, both forces were running in the same room without either one dominating or shutting the other down. It sounds small. It was enormous. Because in that moment, I understood what the integration actually feels like from the inside. It does not feel like a merger or a compromise. It feels like finally being able to use your full sight after years of covering one eye. The depth perception that arrives is completely different from anything either eye can produce on its own. That moment passed quickly, but it left a residue, a kind of knowing that something was possible that I had not been able to access before, and that knowing became the foundation of everything that came next, which was the slow, practical, unglamorous work of actually building the bridge between these two forces consistently, rather than catching occasional glimpses of it over the kitchen sink. The first thing I learned was that you cannot force the integration. Trying to will yourself into wholeness using only the initiating force is exactly the wrong approach. It is like trying to hear music by staring at it harder. The fire cannot manufacture the water. It can only create the conditions where the water is safe enough to move. What that looked like in practice for me was a specific shift in how I began things. Before any significant project or decision, I started giving myself what I can only describe as a listening period. Not long. Sometimes just 15 or 20 minutes of sitting without an agenda and waiting to see what arrived. Not meditating exactly, more like holding a question lightly without gripping it and paying attention to what the body knew before the mind translated it. The deep reader and the spark of beginning both live in that space. The fire is not absent during those minutes, but it is not leading. It is waiting with genuine patience, which for someone with my history of constant forward momentum was genuinely one of the harder things I had ever practiced. The second shift was in how I moved between phases of work. I had always treated the slower, less productive feeling periods of a project as problems to be overcome through more effort. I started treating them instead as the water rising, as the receptive phase doing its essential job of digesting and transforming what the initiating phase had set in motion. When I stopped fighting those periods and started working with them, the quality of what I produced in the active phases changed completely. Ideas arrived that would never have survived under the constant pressure I used to apply. Connections between things appeared that the forcing mode would have bulldozed past without noticing. The third shift was the hardest and the most personal. It involved the anchor, the fourth face of the masculine principle, the one I had described earlier as the most dormant in me. The part that directs full attention toward another person without keeping a strategic distance. I had to learn to let people actually land, not just to process what they were saying while simultaneously formulating my response, but to actually let their reality come into contact with mine and feel the weight of it. This was uncomfortable in a way that the other practices were not. It required me to tolerate a kind of vulnerability that my entire inner architecture had been designed to prevent. But here is what happened when I started practicing it. The relationships in my life changed in quality almost immediately. Not because I became more agreeable or more accommodating, but because people could feel the difference between being heard and being processed. And most people are so rarely genuinely heard that when it happens, it creates a kind of trust that no strategy or performance can replicate. The anchor, the directed fire of genuine presence, turned out to be the single most powerful social force I had ever encountered. And I had kept it locked away for years because I had mistaken it for weakness. These three shifts, the listening period before initiating, the willingness to move with rather than against the slower phases, and the practice of genuine presence with other people, were not a system I invented. They were what emerged naturally once I stopped treating the two principles as problems to be solved and started treating them as partners to be introduced to each other. The fire needed to learn that the water was not its opponent. The water needed to learn that the fire was not going to burn everything down if given space. And that introduction, that slow building of trust between the two forces inside a single person, is what the ancient alchemists were actually describing when they wrote about the sacred marriage. Not a mystical event, not a one-time transformation, a practice, a daily choice to bring both of yourself to whatever you are doing. And the cumulative effect of that choice, made consistently over months, is something I did not have a word for until I simply started calling it by the name it deserved. Wholeness. Not perfection, not the absence of struggle, not a permanent peak state, just the reliable feeling of having access to your full self. The fire and the water both present, both functioning, both contributing to whatever is being built or held or navigated. The compass finally pointing somewhere real. And here is where I want to close this entire story, not with the beginning image of a spinning compass or a hollow apartment, but with something that happened much later, after months of this work, that showed me how completely the inner landscape had shifted. I was sitting in a meeting at work, a difficult one, the kind where people were stressed and the energy in the room had that tight, metallic quality that means everyone is slightly afraid and nobody is saying what they actually think. I noticed myself doing something I would never have done in the old version of myself. I was completely still on the inside while the room was pressured. Not detached, not managing the situation from behind glass, genuinely still and genuinely present at the same time. The striker was ready but not reactive. The deep reader was reading the room accurately. The steady center was holding the quality of the space without needing to control it. And the anchor was fully extended toward every person in that room. In the old days, I would have either dominated that meeting the way Marcus did, or drifted through it on the surface the way I did during my hollow years. Instead, I asked one question at the right moment, and the entire energy shifted. Not because I was clever, because I was whole enough to feel what the room actually needed, rather than what my own anxiety was demanding I provide. The whole person does not look remarkable from the outside. They do not announce themselves. They do not perform their balance. They simply have a quality of presence that other people feel without being able to name exactly what it is. And that quality is available to every single person alive, because every single person alive carries both principles inside them already. The fire and the water are not achievements, they are birthright. The only question is whether you are willing to stop running on one and start learning how to run on both. The real transformation is not loud. It is not dramatic. It does not arrive in a flash of insight or a single breakthrough conversation. It arrives like that plant I saw growing between two buildings on a gray Wednesday morning, slowly, quietly, without asking anyone's permission, simply because the conditions finally allowed it to do what it was always designed to do. You were never one thing. You were always both. The only thing that was ever in the way was the belief that you had to choose. Now I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to think about this honestly before you answer. Which half of yourself have you been quietly punishing for years, the fire or the water? And what has it already cost you that you have been pretending was about something else entirely? Write your answer in the comments. I want to read every single one. If this story reached something real in you, leave a like and subscribe. There is much more coming, and it only gets deeper from here.